Hello, I wanted to talk today about the way you can save data on the player persistently between logging off and logging back on. And the way you do that is through components. So, for example, I want Niblet to despawn whenever I log off and to spawn whenever I log back on. But to do that, I have to save the entity ID of Niblet before I log off, and preferably right whenever I tame him, that entity ID is saved on the player so that whenever the player disconnects, you can look up the entity ID and remove Niblet from the world. And then whenever you log back on, since the data is saved on the player, a component that's on the player, then we can spawn Niblet back in the world whenever you log back on. So, the way that works is, well, let's just hop into the code. So this is the finished version of it. I don't think I'm going to step through the code this time, but I want to explain it, and so that, because I've already explained like the basics of components, so you should already understand like components store data, right? We already created the tame component, and that stores data on Niblet. And what we want to do is create another component called the pet component, and this is what is going to be stored on the player, and that information is going to be the entity ID of the Niblet, the name of the Niblet, and the world's name. The world name is just there so that you're not getting a Niblet if you start a new game. It's just an extra check. I don't have that coded in yet, but that's just the plan. And I also don't have any way of changing the name for Niblet because I haven't figured out how UIs work yet. But that is there as a placeholder for now. So this pet component is just like any other component, has a codec that explains the serialization and deserialization of JSON files. So we're going to save the entity ID, the name, and the world name. And then the way that this component gets added to the player is on this event called onEntityAdd. And the way to hook into this, sorry, I got that mixed up. In the Niblet plugin, the main place for the starting area for your plugin, there's two methods: setup and start. In the setup method, you can catch the player ready event and the player disconnect event and call your own method for those two events. So for me, I created this new method called onPlayerReady, which is just right here. And all this is doing is getting the player, and eventually, after doing a bunch of checks, it is adding Niblet to the world through this command, npc spawn entity. But to be able to know which entity to spawn, it is using the pet component on the player, and the pet component has the entity ID of the Niblet, and then through the entity ID of the Niblet, you can, sorry, one sec. Here it is. Through the pet ID of the Niblet, you can get the UUID of component, which is just the component that stores the ID, the entity ID. And with this, we can set the pet component's pet ID and spawn in a Niblet. I'm not going to go through all of this code because it's mostly just null checks and fancy or just ways to get all the asset or all the references and variables that you need to be able to like actually do stuff. Like you start off with just having a reference to the player up here, then you get the reference to the world, and then you get the player ref, and then you get the player entity ref, and then you get the world the player's entity store, and then you get the player's position, the player's ID, making sure that it's valid, and getting the spawn position, and then actually executing the event of spawning Niblet, which happens right here. Spawn entity. But that's how Niblet gets spawned into the world. Let's look at the action tame and show you how the pet component is actually added to the player. So down here, whenever you successfully tame the Niblet, I am using this method ensure and get component on the player's ref entity store, which is getting from the interaction target. So this is basically saying on this action, because the action's happening on Niblet, so the target, then the interaction iteration target is actually the player. So I'm getting the player ref entity store from this interaction. And then from that, doing a bunch of null checks to see if everything's good, and getting the tame component set up as well. Tame component is just used to set the boolean for taming the Niblet. And then down here, the ensure and get component. This is the part that I was mostly trying to get to, but I got sidetracked. This ensure and get component is basically an add and a getter. So it's literally just adding the component because it doesn't exist on the player, and then getting the component. And then that's being stored in this variable pet component. And then after that, once I have a reference to the pet component, I can set the pet's ID, the world name, and the name of Niblet. So now that the pet component is living on the player's entity, then whenever you log off on player disconnect, I can get the pet component from the player. Then through the pet component, I can get the pet's entity ID. And then with that ID, I can get the entity ref of the pet, and I can remove it from the world. So that's how storing data on the player can work. I've seen a lot of example code where people are using like external third-party sources for saving data whenever there's a perfectly good method of storing data built into Hytale through components. So try to use what they have provided for you built in. Yeah, there's no need for third-party methods of storing data. If you want to store data on an entity, you use a component, add it to the entity. If you want to store data on an NPC, you can do the same thing. If you want to store data on a player, that's just what I explained. I don't really know how it works with blocks, but I'm sure it's pretty similar. You add a component to a block. I'm not going to quote that because I don't really know. I haven't worked with blocks yet. But yeah, that's just a quick explanation of That's just a quick explanation of how you can store data through components. Until next time.